I used to be heavily involved in the urban exploration community, but after what happened last weekend, I'm completely done. I'm writing this from my sister's house because the police still have my apartment taped off as part of an ongoing investigation, and honestly, I don't think I ever want to go back there anyway. For some context, my two best friends, Mark and Chloe, and I have been exploring abandoned buildings for the better part of 5 years. We've seen old hospitals, decaying factories, and forgotten schools. We always followed the golden rule: take nothing but pictures, leave nothing but footprints. But we broke our own rule by going to the old Pinewood Galleria. The Galleria shut down in the late 90s. It was massive, a sprawling complex that the city just let rot because it was too expensive to demolish. We heard rumors on a forum that the city was finally going to bulldoze it next month, so we decided to do one last run. We parked a mile away in a residential subdivision and hiked through the overgrown woods that had reclaimed the back parking lot. It was pitch black on a moonless Friday night. We found our entry point at an old loading dock where the metal door had rusted through at the bottom. We shimmied under, clicking on our high-lumen flashlights as we stood up in the cavernous receiving area. The air inside was thick and heavy, smelling like wet drywall, mold, and decades of stagnant dust. We navigated through the service corridors, our footsteps echoing off the concrete walls, until we pushed through a set of double doors and stepped out into the main promenade. It was incredibly eerie. The skylights above were mostly shattered, letting in slivers of ambient light from the distant city, illuminating the rusted skeletons of old kiosks and the hollowed-out storefronts. We walked past an old arcade, the faded neon carpeting crunching with broken glass under our boots. Mark was snapping photos of the drained central fountain, which was filled with decades of debris and old mannequins that looked entirely too human in the shadows. We were having a great time soaking in the nostalgia until we decided to explore the anchor store at the far end of the mall. It used to be a massive department store, 2 stories high. As we walked through the empty perfume department on the ground floor, Chloe suddenly stopped and grabbed my arm. She shined her light toward the escalators. The metal stairs were completely choked with debris, but right at the base of them, there was a clear, swept path. And at the end of the path was a heavy canvas tarp draped over what used to be the jewelry counters. We should have turned back right then. Every instinct in my body screamed that this wasn't right. Homeless camps in abandoned buildings are common. They're usually messy, clustered near exits and filled with wrappers and sleeping bags. This was different. This was organized. Mark, always the brave one, took a step closer and lifted the edge off the tarp. The smell hit us instantly. A sickening mix of bleach and something deeply rotten. Beneath the tarp wasn't a bed. It was an old dentist's chair, bolted into the concrete floor. Surrounding it were folding tables lined with pristine stainless steel tools. Not medical tools, but heavy-duty hardware. Bolt cutters, hacksaws, pliers, and a small portable blowtorch. But the most terrifying thing was the wall behind the chair. Pinned to the decaying drywall were dozens of Polaroid pictures. They were too far away to make out clearly, but the smears of dark, dried crimson across the floor leading to the heavy metal door in the back told us everything we needed to know. This wasn't a fantasy, and this wasn't ghosts. We had just stumbled into a slaughterhouse. Before any of us could say a word, a sound echoed through the vast, empty department store. It was the heavy, rhythmic screech of metal dragging across tile. It was coming from the second floor right above us. Someone was dragging something incredibly heavy toward the top of the escalator. Chloe clapped a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute terror. The light from Mark's flashlight trembled as he clicked it off. Plunging us into near total darkness. I grabbed both of their jackets and pulled them behind a heavy concrete pillar, just as a beam of yellow light swept down the escalator. The scraping stopped. Heavy booted foots began to descend the metal stairs. I peeked around the edge of the pillar, holding my breath until my lungs burned. A man wearing a dark, heavy vinyl apron was walking down the steps. In one hand, he held a massive, heavy-duty flashlight. In the other, he was dragging a large, black canvas duffel bag. The bag was leaving a thick, wet trail behind it on the stairs. But the detail that will haunt me until the day I die is that the bag was twitching. Whatever, or whoever, was inside was still weakly moving. The man reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. He dropped the bag, and a muffled, wet groan came from inside it. The man didn't react. Instead, he slowly swept his flashlight across the floor. He noticed the tarp. It wasn't draped exactly the way it had been before Mark touched it. The man stood completely still for what felt like an eternity. Then, in a voice that was perfectly calm and conversational, he called out into the empty store. "I know you're in here. You tracked mud on my floor." My heart was hammering so hard against my ribs, I thought it would crack them. Mark was silently crying, and Chloe was completely frozen, hyperventilating through her nose. The man started walking toward our pillar. He was whistling a slow, off-key tune. He was 10 feet away, and then 5 feet. I looked at Mark, nodded toward the exit we had come from, and silently mouthed the word "run." As the man stepped around the left side of the pillar, the three of us bolted around the right. The man let out a furious, animalistic roar. I didn't look back. We sprinted through the dark mall, crashing into old benches, tearing our clothes on exposed rebar and slipping on the debris. The heavy thud of his boots echoed behind us, accompanied by the sweeping beam of his flashlight. We scrambled under the rusted loading dock door, scraping our backs on the metal, and ran full tilt into the woods. We didn't stop running until we hit my car. We locked the doors and called 911 immediately. The police raided the mall an hour later. They found the room, they found the tools, and they found the bag. But the man was gone, disappearing into the labyrinth of the rotting mall. They identified the person in the bag and the victims in the Polaroids. The police told me that the man had clearly been living there for months. The reason I can't go back to my apartment is that when the police searched the camp, they found my dropped flashlight, which had my name and address etched into the handle. Now, every time I hear a floorboard creak, I expect to see that yellow flashlight beam sweeping under my door. I have worked a graveyard shift at an independent gas station just off Interstate 40 for the last 3 years. It's a miserable job, but it pays tuition, and usually, the worst thing I have to deal with is a drunk trucker or kids trying to buy beer with terrible fake IDs. The station is entirely surrounded by flat, empty desert. At night, It feels like you are sitting in a glass box at the edge of the universe. 2 nights ago, I clocked in at midnight. The previous clerk, an older guy named Dave, told me it had been a dead night and tossed me the keys. I locked the front doors, setting the system so I had to buzz people in. It was a strict company policy for the night shift, and I never broke it. Around 3 a.m., the boredom was at its peak. I was sitting behind the raised counter, reading a textbook under the fluorescent lights, when a beat-up, windowless white van pulled up to pump number 4. The pump was out of order, and there was a bright yellow bag over the nozzle. The driver sat in the van for a solid 10 minutes with the engine idling. My stomach did a little flip, that primal instinct telling you something is off. Eventually, the driver's side door opened. A guy stepped out. He was tall, wearing a heavy dark green winter coat with the hood pulled up, which was insane considering it was 80 degrees outside in the middle of summer. He kept his head down and walked straight to the glass doors. He pulled on the handle. It was locked. He looked up, staring right at me through the glass. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and completely devoid of any expression. He raised a finger and tapped on the glass, gesturing for me to let him in. I shook my head, pointed to the small pass-through drawer we use for late-night transactions, and turned on the intercom. "Can I help you through the window, sir?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The man walked over to the speaker. "I need to come inside. I need to browse," he said. His voice was raspy, like he hadn't spoken in days. I told him no. Company policy. He stared at me for another long moment, and then smiled. It was a terrible, thin smile. "There are only 2 cameras in here," he whispered into the intercom. "One on the register, one on the door. Nothing in the back aisle." Then he turned around, walked back to his van, and drove away, heading down the dark highway. I was shaking. I grabbed the store phone and considered calling the police, but I figured they would just laugh at me for being scared of a weird customer. I tried to calm down and go back to my book. About 30 minutes later, the power cut out. The station was plunged into absolute suffocating darkness. Only the dull green glow of the emergency exit signs remained. The silence was deafening. The hum of the refrigerators and the air conditioner had completely vanished. I reached under the counter for the heavy metal mag light we kept for emergencies. As my fingers wrapped around the handle, I heard it. A soft, scraping sound coming from the back of the store. Specifically, from the heavy steel door that leads to the alley where the dumpsters are kept. The door was deadbolted, but the scraping was persistent. It sounded like metal sliding against metal. Someone was picking the lock. I dropped the flashlight and hit the silent panic button under the register, which goes directly to the county dispatch. But I knew the nearest sheriff's deputy was at least 20 minutes away. Suddenly, a massive crash shook the entire building. The steel door hadn't been picked. It had been hit with a sledgehammer. The deadbolt groaned. Another crash, louder this time. The door frame splintered. I didn't wait. I scrambled out from behind the counter and ran for the only secure room in the building, the manager's office. It had a heavy, solid core door and an internal deadbolt. I slammed it shut behind me, locked it, and shoved the heavy filing cabinet in front of it. I sat on the floor in the pitch-black office, pulling my knees to my chest, trying to silence my own breathing. I heard the back door finally give way with a horrific screech of tearing metal. Heavy footsteps entered the store, but it wasn't just one set of footsteps. I heard two, maybe three distinct pairs of boots walking down the aisles. They weren't whispering, they were talking loudly, casually. "Check the register," a deep voice said. "If the safe is locked, find the kid." The sound of the cash register being smashed open echoed through the thin walls of the office. They were tearing the store apart, knocking over shelves and shattering glass bottles. Then, the footsteps approached the office. The handle jiggled. "Locked," a voice muttered. A heavy fist pounded on the door. "Hey, buddy," the raspy voice from earlier called out. "We know you're in there. We just want the safe combo. Open up and we won't have to hurt you." I didn't make a sound. Tears were streaming down my face. The pounding turned into violent kicking. The wood of the doorframe began to crack. I crawled backward until my back hit the wall, gripping a letter opener from the desk like it would actually save me. The door buckled inward, the hinges screaming. They were going to get in. They hit the door again, and the top hinge completely snapped. A beam of flashlight swept into the office through the crack. Just as they backed up to deliver what would have been the final blow, the parking lot was flooded with strobing red and blue lights. Sirens pierced the night. The men froze. I heard them sprint toward the back of the store, scrambling out into the alley. It took the police 10 minutes to convince me to come out of the office. The store was destroyed. The back door was completely ripped off its hinges. The police told me later that the men had parked the van a mile down the road and hiked through the desert to the back of the building. They had cut the power lines themselves. I quit my job the next morning. I've always been an avid hiker. Last October, I took a solo trip out to a massive, heavily forested national park in the Pacific Northwest. I wanted to get far away from civilization, so I sought out a remote trail that wasn't well advertised. When I arrived at the ranger station near the trailhead to register my route, there was only one ranger on duty. He was an older guy, friendly with a thick beard and a warm smile. He looked over my map and shook his head. "You don't want to take the Ridge Trail," he told me, leaning over the counter. "It's washed out a few miles in. If you want a real scenic route, take the old Loggers Path. It's not on the official maps anymore, but it follows the river and leads to an incredible waterfall. Total isolation. You won't see another soul." He traced a line on my map with his pen, showing me where to veer off the main trail. I thanked him, excited for the exclusive adventure, and set off into the woods. The first few hours were breathtaking. The ancient pines towered above me, filtering the sunlight into beams of gold. The air was crisp and smelled of pine needles and damp earth. I followed the river exactly as the ranger had described, but around mid-afternoon, the atmosphere of the forest began to shift. The vibrant chirping of birds and the rustling of squirrels completely ceased. The woods became deathly silent, save for the crunch of my own boots. The weather turned, thick gray clouds rolling in and casting long, ominous shadows across the forest floor. That was when I started noticing the markers. At first, it was just a strange pile of rocks. But as I walked further, the markers became disturbing. I found a crude tripod made of thick branches lashed together with what looked like dirty shoelaces. A mile later, I found a piece of torn, blood-stained fabric snagged on a thorn bush. My unease was growing into a genuine anxiety. I decided the waterfall wasn't worth it and turned around to head back to my car. As I turned, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. About 50 yards away, standing perfectly still behind a massive oak tree, was a figure. It was a person, but they looked completely feral. They were draped in filthy, ragged clothing that hung off a skeletal frame. Their hair was matted with mud and leaves covering their face. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it stepped out from behind the tree. It was holding a large, jagged piece of rusted metal, gripping it so tightly its knuckles were white. The figure began to walk toward me. Not a casual walk, but a deliberate stalking glide. Panic flooded my system. I turned and started speed walking back down the trail, looking over my shoulder every few seconds. The figure matched my pace. When I sped up, it sped up. It wasn't trying to hide anymore, it was actively hunting me. I broke into a full sprint. The adrenaline pushed me faster than I had ever run in my life. I heard the snapping of branches and the heavy, ragged breathing of my pursuer right behind me. I didn't stop to look. I ran blindly, tearing through the underbrush, slipping on mossy rocks until the trail finally widened and I saw the glint of my car in the gravel lot. I practically dove into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and slammed my hand on the horn. I looked back at the tree line, expecting the feral person to emerge, but there was nothing. The woods were still. I peeled out of the lot, spraying gravel, and drove straight back to the ranger station. I burst through the doors, hyperventilating, and found the same friendly ranger sitting behind the desk. "Whoa, calm down," he said, standing up. "What happened?" I poured my heart out, telling him about the markers, the feral person, the chase, everything. I told him he needed to call the police immediately. The ranger listened intently, his expression morphing from concern to a deep, stoic seriousness. He walked over to the front door of the station, flipped the sign to closed, and threw the heavy deadbolt shut. He turned to face me, and the warm, friendly demeanor was completely gone. His eyes were cold and dead. "You're faster than you look," the ranger said, his voice completely flat. "Usually, they don't make it back to the car." I backed away, bumping into a display of trail maps. The horror washed over me like ice water. The feral person in the woods wasn't a monster. The bloody fabric, the shoelaces, the gaunt, starving frame. The person hadn't been hunting me. They were a previous hiker, a victim who had somehow escaped the ranger's trap deep in the off-book trail. The jagged piece of metal they were holding wasn't a weapon meant for me. They had been trying to intercept me, trying to scare me off the path before I reached the end of the line. The ranger slowly reached under the counter and pulled out a heavy hunting knife. "It's a shame," he smiled, taking a step toward me. "I really thought my pet would have caught you by now." There's a cardinal rule among urban explorers that I've always sworn by: never go into a building alone. But when the city announced they were finally demolishing the old Blackwood Memorial Hospital the following morning, I knew I didn't have time to wait for my usual group. Blackwood was a local legend, a hulking Gothic monolith of brick and rusted iron that had been sitting entirely abandoned on the edge of town since a devastating electrical fire shut it down in the late 80s. It was the crown jewel of forgotten architecture, and I needed to photograph it before the wrecking balls turned it into dust. I parked my car a mile down the access road just past midnight, navigating through overgrown woods with a single high-beam flashlight. The air was thick and humid, but the moment I slipped through a shattered basement window and set foot inside the hospital, the temperature plummeted. It smelled exactly like you would expect: a cloying, heavy mixture of wet rot, ancient dust, and the faint, unsettling phantom scent of iodine. I spent the first hour exploring the ground floors, my camera clicking methodically as I documented the decay. I photographed shattering waiting rooms reclaimed by climbing ivy, patient files strewn across linoleum floors like fallen leaves, and overturned wheelchairs rotting in the dark corridors. It was eerie, but it was exactly what I came for. The strange part didn't happen until I reached the 4th floor, the former surgical wing. The moment I pushed through the heavy, water-damaged double doors of the ward, the ambient noises of the settling building seemed to vanish. The silence became absolute, heavy, and suffocating. As I swept my flashlight down the long, pitch-black hallway, the beam caught something completely out of place. At the very end of the corridor, the door to Operating Theater B was propped open, and a soft, pale fluorescent light was spilling out onto the dirty floor tiles. Every instinct told me to turn around and run, but morbid curiosity pulled me forward. I crept down the hallway, keeping my back to the peeling wallpaper, my breathing shallow. When I reached the door, I peeked inside and my blood ran ice cold. The operating theater wasn't abandoned. Unlike the rest of the rotting hospital, this room was pristine. The stainless steel tables gleamed, the white tile floor was spotless, and the overhead surgical lamps were humming with electricity, casting a blinding white light over an empty operating table. But the most terrifying detail was the observation window. It was a massive pane of one-way glass overlooking the room, and standing on the other side of it, looking down at the empty table, were 3 figures in dark green surgical scrubs. Their faces were obscured by masks, but they were perfectly still, their eyes locked on the empty leather straps of the bed. I stood frozen in the doorway, my camera dangling uselessly from my neck. I slowly took a step backward, desperately trying not to make a sound, but my boot crunched loudly on a piece of broken glass that had spilled over from the hallway. Instantly, all 3 figures behind the glass snapped their heads up and looked directly at me. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by a fear so primal it felt like a physical weight on my chest. The figures in the center slowly reached out and pressed the intercom button on the wall. The old static-filled speaker in the corner of the operating theater crackled to life. But it wasn't a doctor's voice that came through. It was my voice. It was the exact sound of me, weeping hysterically, begging someone to let me out of the dark. I panicked and turned to run, sprinting blindly down the long corridor toward the stairwell. I threw my weight against the heavy double doors I had entered through, but they wouldn't budge. They were sealed shut, fused into the doorframe. As I turned back around, panting and trapped in the pitch black hallway, I realized the pale light from the operating room was gone. The entire wing was consumed by darkness, and from the far end of the hallway, the heavy, rhythmic sound of a squeaking gurney began rolling slowly toward me in the dark. I reached for my flashlight to turn it back on, but my hand passed straight through the metal casing, right through my own chest, grasping at nothing but cold, empty air. Working the graveyard shift at a massive 24-hour indoor self-storage facility is a special kind of sensory deprivation. The building is a sprawling, windowless labyrinth of concrete floors, corrugated orange metal doors, and flickering fluorescent lights that hum with a frequency that burrows right into your skull. I work the desk, monitoring the bank of security cameras, while my coworker, a quiet guy named Marcus, did the physical perimeter checks. It was incredibly mundane work, punctuated only by the occasional insomniac coming in to dig through their boxes at 3 in the morning. We had a simple routine. Every 2 hours, Marcus would take a walkie-talkie and a heavy flashlight, walk the entire 4-story grid, and report back. On a humid Tuesday night, right around 3:30 in the morning, Marcus was doing his sweep of the 4th floor. Specifically, the long, isolated corridor known as Block C. I was sitting at the front desk, fighting off sleep with stale coffee, idly watching him on monitor number 7 as he strolled past the endless rows of identical orange doors. The radio on my desk hissed with static. "Hey man," Marcus's voice crackled through the speaker. "I'm on the 4th floor, halfway down Block C. Unit 414 has a busted padlock. It's hanging wide open. I'm gonna step inside and make sure nobody is squatting in there." I pressed the button on my radio. "Copy that, Marcus. Be careful. Let me know if you need me to call the cops." I leaned forward, my eyes fixed on the black and white feed of monitor 7. I watched Marcus stop in front of Unit 414. He shone his flashlight into the dark interior, hesitated for a moment, and then stepped inside, disappearing from the camera's view. I took a sip of my coffee and waited. 2 minutes went by, then 4. The storage units weren't that big. It shouldn't take more than 30 seconds to sweep one. I picked up the radio. "Marcus, you good in there? What's the status?" There was a long pause followed by a burst of heavy static. "Yeah, I'm fine," Marcus replied, though his voice sounded tight and slightly out of breath. "It's just full of old mannequins and heavy furniture. But hey, the hallway lights out here just died. Can you hit the breaker? It's pitch black." I frowned, staring directly at monitor 7. The hallway lights on the 4th floor were absolutely fine. The corridor was brightly illuminated, casting sharp shadows against the orange metal. "Marcus, the lights are on," I said into the radio, a knot of unease forming in my stomach. "I'm looking right at Block C. Everything is fully lit." Silence. The radio hummed quietly on my desk. "Marcus?" I asked again. When he finally replied, his voice was a terrified, trembling whisper. "If the lights out there are on, then where the hell did I just walk into?" My eyes darted back to the monitor. At the far end of the hallway on the screen, stepping out of the stairwell, was a figure. It was Marcus. I watched the camera feed in utter disbelief as the figure of Marcus walked casually down the brightly lit hallway. He stopped directly in front of Unit 414. He reached up, grabbed the handle of the corrugated metal door, and violently slammed it shut, sliding a heavy steel deadbolt across the front, locking whatever was inside in total darkness. The radio on my desk erupted. It was Marcus screaming. It was a raw, guttural sound of pure terror, accompanied by the frantic, muffled thudding of fists pounding against heavy metal. But the sound wasn't coming from the walkie-talkie. It was echoing faintly down the elevator shaft from the 4th floor. I looked back at the monitor. The figure that looked exactly like Marcus turned slowly to face the security camera. It stared directly into the lens, its face completely devoid of expression, its eyes pitch black hollows in the grain of the security feed. It raised a single finger to its lips in a shushing gesture. Then, the figure reached to its belt, unclipped its own walkie-talkie, and raised it to its mouth. My radio crackled loudly, and a voice came through the speaker. It was my own voice, perfectly replicated, echoing in the quiet lobby. "Copy that, Marcus. Be careful. Let me know if you need me to call the cops." On the screen, the figure smiled, turned away from the camera, and began walking calmly toward the elevator that led down to the lobby.